It began with a funeral no one wanted to attend. A house stood on the edge of a dying town in Virginia, its paint blistered by time, its windows sealed shut against the world. Inside, the portraits watched. Eyes too lifelike, smiles too deliberate. The kind of family that looked perfect until you looked too long. For 70 years, the Crawfords were the picture of respectability. Landowners, church patrons, old money wrapped in Southern charm. But every townsperson whispered the same thing: he's wrong in that house. Children grew up under strict silence, laughter forbidden after dusk, and visitors rarely crossed the threshold twice. When the patriarch, Walter Crawford, was laid to rest in 1982, the coffin was heavier than anyone expected, and when his eldest son tried to lift it, he whispered something to the undertaker that made him drop his end. No one ever said what it was. But that night, half the family fled town. Years later, when the house was sold off for debts, a state investigator found a box nailed beneath the floorboards of the master bedroom. Inside, photographs that should not exist, pictures of people who looked identical but decades apart, generations repeating the same faces, same eyes, same mouths. It wasn't until a DNA test in 2019, long after the last Crawford had died, that the truth began to surface. But by then, the story had already started to rot. Because what the Crawfords were hiding wasn't just a crime. It was a design. A pattern that spanned nearly a century. Built on deception. Preserved by silence. Protected by the one thing no one could question: family. And when that illusion finally shattered, it didn't just destroy the Crawfords. It tore open the town's history, exposing a secret that connected blood, inheritance, and madness. This is the story of how one American family built an empire of lies, and how it all collapsed, under the weight of its own reflection. They called it Crawford Hill, a stretch of land just outside of Roanoke, Virginia, where the soil was thick with clay and old secrets. The first Crawford to build there was Samuel in 1894, a Civil War orphan who arrived with no records, no family name beyond the one he chose for himself. Neighbors said he spoke little, but when he did, his words were rehearsed, almost borrowed. He built the Crawford house by hand, 3 stories tall, with walls thick enough to muffle a scream. He married young to a woman named Eleanor, whose family disappeared from county records just a year later. Their children were pale, reserved, and almost unnervingly identical. People joked that the Crawfords were born from the same mold, but no one ever laughed twice. Inside that house, generations grew without ever leaving. Marriages stayed within the same bloodlines, cousins raised as siblings, and those siblings. Something more. By the 1930s, Crawford Hill was more of a compound than a home. Each new birth looked eerily like the last, as if time itself refused to move forward. Visitors recalled a strange rule in the house. Mirrors were covered on Sundays. When asked why, Walter Crawford, Samuel's grandson, would simply smile and say, "We don't want to confuse the children." But it was more than superstition. Photographs from that time show inconsistencies. A child who appeared in 1924 and again unchanged in a photo from 1942. Faces repeating, aging out of sequence. Family gatherings where everyone shared the same eyes. That same sharp, knowing stare. By the time the Great Depression hit, the Crawfords were wealthy beyond reason. No one understood how. The farm produced little, the family never worked outside their land, and yet they bought out half the town. It was whispered that Samuel's descendants had found something under the hill. Not gold, not oil, something else. Something they were willing to keep in the family. For decades, the Crawfords lived like ghosts in daylight. Polite smiles, pristine manners, and an unspoken fear of outsiders. The children were homeschooled, the wives rarely seen. And when one of them tried to run, the records stopped mentioning her name. The Crawfords didn't just live on Crawford Hill. They were it. The land, the house, the curse, all bound together in silence. It was in 1956 when the first real crack appeared in the Crawford legacy. A storm had ripped through the valley, tearing down power lines and flooding the lower fields. A deputy sheriff, making rounds, stopped at the Crawford property after spotting a lantern still burning in the upstairs window, long after curfew. He knocked. No one answered. But through the crack in the front door, he saw something that chilled him. A row of chairs, all facing the same direction, each one occupied by a member of the family motionless. Hands folded, eyes open, as if they were waiting for something. When he called out, none of them moved. Only Walter, the eldest son, turned his head, slow, deliberate, and asked the deputy to leave. The next morning, the deputy's report was missing from the station log. 2 weeks later, he resigned and left the county for good. Around that time, people started noticing strange things on the Crawford property. Lights in the attic that flickered all night. Sounds like a child crying near the well. And those portraits, the ones that hung in the main hall, they seemed to change. Neighbors swore that the faces shifted slightly from one year to the next. Then came the fire. A small blaze started in the east wing in 1961. It was quickly contained. But when the insurance assessor went through the damage, he found something behind the scorched plaster. Dozens of black and white photographs hidden in the walls like insulation. They were all of the same woman, taken over 40 years. But in every image, she looked exactly the same age. 23. Her name, scrawled on the back of one of the photos, was Eleanor Crawford. But according to public records, the original Eleanor, Samuel's wife, had died in 1907. So who was the woman in the photographs? And why was she still being photographed half a century later? That's when the whispers turned darker. Some said the Crawfords weren't just protecting a secret, they were preserving it. That their lineage wasn't about love or loyalty, but about control. That something was being passed down that shouldn't have been human at all. And for the first time in their long, guarded history, the Crawfords began to make mistakes. By 1973, Crawford Hill was dying. The once proud estate was decaying from the inside, the wallpaper blistered with damp, floorboards soft with rot. But what was rotting faster was the family itself. Walter Crawford, now the patriarch, ruled his home with the kind of calm that hides violence. His children spoke only when spoken to, and his wife, Margaret, was rarely seen outside her upstairs room. People said she'd fallen ill, but her silhouette was sometimes visible at the window, long after midnight, standing completely still for hours. There were rumors that Walter had become obsessed with purity. He kept meticulous records, ledgers filled with dates, bloodlines, and notes written in Latin. He believed the Crawfords carried a gift, something that made them different from ordinary people, something the outside world would never understand. But that gift came with a price. Each generation grew paler, frailer, less human. Photographs from that decade show faces too symmetrical, eyes that almost seemed reflective. The local doctor, who had treated the family for years, left town abruptly after a visit one winter evening. He told his nurse never to take calls from Crawford Hill again. The breaking point came with Walter's youngest daughter, Anna. She was 16 when she began writing letters to a boy in town, the son of a mechanic. Harmless, innocent. But when Walter found the letters, Anna vanished. The boy was found days later in his truck by the river, his wrists cut cleanly, both hands folded across his chest. After that, no one went near the Crawfords. The house became silent, unnaturally so. But those who lived close by swore they could still hear a piano playing at night, faintly, a single song repeating over and over. The single song repeating owner Crawford had played in a photograph from 1899. In the years that followed, the remaining Crawfords stopped appearing in public altogether. Mail piled up at their gate. Church attendance ceased. The town forgot them, or pretended to. But the family's money still flowed. Taxes paid, land kept, accounts active. It was as if the Crawfords had erased themselves, except on paper. And yet, on certain nights, when the mist rolled through the valley, the people of Roanoke swore they could still see the light from that attic window. When the house finally went dark in the winter of 1982, No one noticed for weeks. Snow blanketed Crawford Hill, sealing it in silence. It was only when the mail carrier reported a strange odor drifting down the path that the sheriff agreed to check the property. What they found inside became legend. The house was intact, untouched, almost preserved, but there were no signs of life. Dinner plates still sat on the table, food long turned to dust. A record player clicked endlessly in the parlor, the needles scratching against silence. And upstairs in the largest bedroom, Walter Crawford lay in bed, dressed in his Sunday best, hands crossed neatly over his chest. But he wasn't alone. Beside him lay Margaret, the wife no one had seen in nearly 15 years. Her body had not decomposed the way it should have. Her face was pale, her lips faintly blue, but her features were untouched by time. She looked almost peaceful, almost alive. In the next room, they found rows of jars, labeled, dated, sealed. Inside each one, something small. Fingernail clippings, strands of hair, teeth, each marked with a name and a date of birth. The sheriff closed the lids and ordered the room sealed. The official report said natural causes. But the undertaker told a different story. He said the bodies were heavy, heavier than any corpse he'd ever lifted. He claimed he heard a sound when they moved Walter, like a sigh, escaping the lungs of something that had been waiting too long. At the funeral, the few who came noticed something unsettling. The portraits that had once hung in the Crawford home were brought out, lined along the church walls. The faces in the paintings, the same family faces that spanned generations, seemed clearer than ever. But one portrait, the oldest, bore a face identical to Walter's. The inscription read, Samuel Crawford, 1896. The resemblance was perfect, too perfect. When the coffins were lowered into the frozen earth, the ground cracked open, revealing a layer of stone, man-laid, rectangular, like a foundation. Beneath it, something metallic glinted in the snow. No one touched it. The sheriff ordered the site closed and the record sealed. And after that day, no one ever spoke the name Crawford in that town again. For decades, the house sat abandoned, a monument to silence. The town grew around it, but no one dared to claim the land. Children whispered dares to touch its gate. Teenagers who tried to sneak inside came back pale, trembling, unable to speak. One girl swore she saw someone standing in the upstairs window, even though the floors had collapsed years before. By the early 2000s, Crawford Hill had become a myth. The county called it condemned, but the taxes kept getting paid, automatically, by an account linked to no living heir. When a development company finally bought the property in 2019, they sent in a demolition crew. What they found beneath the floorboards turned rumor into nightmare. Behind a false wall in the basement was a narrow staircase spiraling downward, deeper than the blueprints suggested. At the bottom, a small room. No furniture, just mirrors. Dozens of them, covering every inch of the walls, ceiling, even the floor. Each one reflecting the others, multiplying endlessly. And at the center, a single wooden chair. On it lay an old photograph. A woman in a white dress, her eyes closed, her hands resting gently on her stomach. The label on the back read, Eleanor Crawford, 1894. But the image was in color. DNA testing on samples from the site revealed something stranger still. The bones buried in the Crawford cemetery didn't match their headstones. Many were genetically identical, not siblings, not cousins, but clones. Exact copies, decades apart. No one could explain it. The records were incomplete, the local archives missing years of data. But those who studied the remains noticed something consistent. Every generation of Crawfords shared one rare genetic marker, one almost impossible mutation. A sequence associated with longevity and instability. That discovery brought the Crawfords back into the light. Forensic scientists, historians, journalists, all searching for an answer. What they found instead was absence. The family Bible was gone. The portraits, missing. Even the graves had been disturbed. And yet, late at night, neighbors still see a faint glow where the attic once stood. A single light, flickering, as if someone, or something, is still watching from above. because the Crawfords may have died, but their reflection never did. The government investigation that followed was brief, too brief. Officials arrived without notice, confiscated every document, every photograph, every remaining bone fragment. Within weeks, Crawford Hill was bulldozed flat. The official statement called it a public safety hazard. But those who watched the demolition said something peculiar. The soil beneath the foundation was black. Not burned, not wet. Just black, like ink seeping upward through the clay. Rumors spread that the Crawfords had been part of something larger. A private genetic experiment, maybe, started during the early 1900s when eugenics was quietly promoted under the banner of progress. Some said Samuel Crawford hadn't been an orphan at all, but a participant, or a subject, in a secret program designed to preserve superior traits. The kind of research the U.S. quietly buried after the war. But that theory didn't explain the photographs. It didn't explain how Eleanor looked unchanged across 50 years, or why multiple DNA samples matched her exactly. Nor did it explain the notebooks found in a nearby storage locker. Hundreds of pages of looping handwriting, detailing iterations, replications, and something called Project Reflection. The earliest entry was dated 1892, the final one, 1982. 90 years, a full century of perfect continuity. One line repeated across several entries, scrawled like a prayer. We'll keep what is perfect. We remove what remembers. Historians who examined the notes described them as chillingly methodical. Crossbreeding charts, family trees, even diagrams of eyes. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the science. It was the tone. Whoever wrote those words didn't sound mad. They sounded proud. When journalists pressed local authorities for answers, every request was denied. All records sealed for national security. Even the property deeds vanished from the county database. And so, the Crawfords became a ghost story once more. One the government refused to acknowledge, and the town refused to discuss. But those who lived closest to the ruins began to notice something unsettling. Their children were born with eyes a shade lighter than before. Their reflections sometimes lagged in the mirror, and in the quietest hours before dawn, when the mist rolled down the hill, they swore they could hear that piano again. Faint, distant, repeating one single song. The demolition company foreman, a man named Richard Hale, was the first to break silence. In a late-night interview years later, he said something that never made it into the official reports. The morning before the bulldozers came, he'd gone into what was left of the basement to tag a gas line. That's when he noticed one of the mirrors, the largest one, wasn't reflecting him properly. He stepped closer, thinking it was just dust or warping. But as he leaned in, the figure in the mirror didn't move with him. It stayed perfectly still. The reflection's eyes blinked once, then the glass cracked, not shattered, just a single line, like a vein beneath the surface. Hale ran. He quit that day and never went back. Within months, 3 members of his crew died in unrelated accidents. One in a car crash, one from a heart attack. One went missing in the Appalachian woods, his body never found. Local legend says all 3 were buried under mirrored headstones, their names engraved backward by mistake. That was the last anyone tried to touch the site. Still, the myth grew. College students researching genetic ethics started calling the Crawfords America's forgotten experiment. Online forums shared distorted photos, claiming to show Eleanor's face appearing in random mirrors. Some said if you stared too long into your reflection at midnight and whispered her name, you'd see another version of yourself. The Crawford version. The one that never aged. But underneath all the internet folklore, one truth remained. The Crawfords had achieved something no one else had. The illusion of immortality. Not through faith, not through wealth, but through replication. They had copied themselves so completely that even death couldn't untangle the line between what was real and what was reflection. And maybe that's what finally consumed them. The moment the reflection began to believe it was the original. If you're still watching, You're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have kept the secret or burned it all to ash? Because every family carries something in its reflection. Some just choose not to look too closely. In 2021, a historian from Richmond named Laura Benning obtained temporary access to the sealed Crawford archives, at least what was left of them. Among the boxes was a single roll of film labeled simply "Mirror Tests." It was badly damaged, but a few frames could still be recovered. They showed what looked like a small room, lit by a single hanging bulb. In the first frame, a woman sits on a chair, her face blurred by movement. In the second, she's gone. Only the chair remains, her reflection still visible in the mirror behind it. Benning stopped there. She refused to release the images to the public, claiming it wasn't photography in any human sense. But others who'd seen the negatives said something different, that the woman's reflection wasn't looking at the camera. It was looking past it. Not long after, Benning withdrew from her university post and vanished from public life. Her last recorded statement was an email to a colleague. The Crawfords didn't die. They changed form. After that, the archives were seized again, this time by a federal agency no one could identify. The files were moved, sealed, and cataloged under a new name, Project Mirrorline. Every trace of the Crawfords disappeared from official databases. Even genealogy websites purged their entries. But digital ghosts are harder to kill. People began finding fragments of family photos online, altered versions of old Crawford portraits. Same poses, same lighting, but different names underneath. New families, modern surnames, faces that didn't just resemble the Crawfords. They were the Crawfords. The resemblance was undeniable. Same bone structure, same color of eyes. And across the United States, reports began to surface of small town families claiming old land deeds tied to Crawford holdings, entire neighborhoods built on soil once belonging to Crawford Hill. It was as if the bloodline had spread invisibly, dispersing itself through the country one generation at a time until it became untraceable. You might think this is where the story ends, but it isn't. Because if the Crawfords succeeded in what they were trying to do, they're not a family anymore. They're a pattern made of faces, of eyes, of perfect repetition. And patterns, as history has shown, always find a way to repeat themselves. There's a story that one of the demolition workers kept a fragment of glass from the Crawford mirrors, small enough to fit in his pocket. He thought it was harmless, a souvenir from a creepy job. A year later, his wife found him sitting at the kitchen table at 3 a.m., staring into that shard like it was a window. He said he could see someone else on the other side, someone who looked just like him, only smiling. He smashed it the next morning and threw the pieces into the river. But when they drained that section years later for maintenance, the divers found something strange. Hundreds of mirror fragments scattered along the riverbed, as if others had done the same. That's when the folklore changed. People started saying the Crawfords hadn't been destroyed. They'd been released. That when the mirrors cracked, whatever they were keeping in had slipped through the fractures and found its way into the world. And then the sightings began. Families in North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, all reporting the same thing. A figure standing near their windows at night, silent, motionless, wearing old-fashioned clothes. When they called out, the figure would lift its head slowly and disappear. But the next morning, they'd find handprints on the glass. From the inside. The strange part, every family that reported these incidents had some distant ancestor with a connection to the Crawfords. Sometimes by marriage, sometimes by land ownership, sometimes by blood. Experts call it coincidence. But those who've seen it say otherwise. They describe a feeling like being watched not by someone else, but by yourself. Some even claim that's how the Crawfords perpetuated their legacy. Not through time, but through reflection. Every mirror, every photograph, every shiny surface they ever touched became a doorway, waiting to remember them. And maybe that's why those portraits always felt alive, because they were never just paintings. They were records, windows, copies. So if you ever find yourself standing before an old mirror in a house that doesn't feel quite empty, look closely at your reflection. If it moves a fraction too late, you might be standing on Crawford Hill. In 2023, a podcast host from Kentucky decided to dedicate an entire season to unraveling the Crawford mystery. He called it The House That Remembered Itself. What began as a small local project spiraled into something he couldn't control. His research uncovered property deeds, census records, and photographs dating back to the late 1800s, all altered, all showing traces of the same faces, reused under new names. In one episode, he interviewed a woman from Texas who claimed her grandmother used to whisper, "Don't let them see your eyes in the mirror." The grandmother was born in Roanoke. Her maiden name? Crawford. Weeks later, the host released his final episode. His voice trembled as he read an excerpt from a letter found in a courthouse basement, written by Walter Crawford himself in 1978. It said, "We'll learn to trap time in reflection, to copy what God refused to repeat. But in doing so, we made something that no longer needed us." After that episode aired, the host vanished. His apartment was found empty except for one thing: a mirror leaning against the wall, covered with a white sheet. Etched faintly into the glass were the words, "We never left." Authorities treated it as a publicity stunt. The podcast was removed from every platform within days, citing copyright disputes. But those who downloaded it early noticed something else. Between segments, when the audio went silent, there was a faint echo, the sound of breathing, not from the host, but from behind the microphone. The episode ends with a quiet, trembling voice whispering, "Do you remember me?" Even now, clips resurface online, distorted, fragmented. Each time they're taken down, new versions appear, slightly different, as though the story is rewriting itself. And in a way, maybe it is. Because stories like this don't die. They wait. They echo through generations, taking on new faces, new names, new mirrors. And maybe that's the true curse of the Crawfords. Not that they lived a lie, but that their lie learned to live without them. You can bury the land. You can burn the house. But you can't destroy a reflection that has already learned your face. A few months ago, a real estate listing quietly appeared online. Historic property for sale. Former family estate. Roanoke County, Virginia. No photos, no description, just an address. The starting bid was $1. Within 24 hours, the listing vanished. But not before a few curious users managed to save the page and post it on Reddit. People who traced the coordinates said there was nothing there, just an empty field, fenced off, no road leading in. Yet satellite images showed something impossible, faint rectangular outlines in the dirt, the shape of old foundations, and in one of them, a single dark spot that looked like a well. A local man, a hobby drone pilot, flew over the site to see for himself. His footage lasted only 19 seconds before cutting to static. But in the final frame, just before the feed dropped, a reflection flashed across the lens. Not the drone, not the clouds. A woman's face, blurred but smiling. The pilot deleted the footage that night. 3 days later, his account posted a new video automatically, titled, "The Family That Lived a Lee." No one has been able to trace where it uploaded from. Historians now refer to the Crawfords as a cultural ghost story, a metaphor for the American obsession with legacy, purity, and control. But some still insist there's more. That somewhere out there, pieces of the original bloodline remain, hidden in plain sight, their features diluted but unmistakable. Every year, at least one visitor to Roanoke claims to see a light flicker on that hill at exactly midnight, even though there's no power line for miles. Some hear a piano note drift through the fog. One, just one, then silence. And maybe that's how the Crawfords survive now, not in bodies or names, but in attention. Every time their story is told, every time someone searches their name, a trace of them wakes again, like dust rising from a forgotten grave. So if you're hearing this, you've already opened the door. You've looked into their reflection. And if, after this video ends, you catch your own face lingering a second too long in the black of your screen, don't be afraid.